Good afternoon and welcome everybody. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maria Lochry and I'm the Athena Swan Officer within the University's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion team in the People and Culture Directorate. As part of that role, I oversee the University's engagement with the Athena Swan Gender Equality Charter, which is a framework used to support and transform gender equality in higher education and research. And one of the university's 4 core values is collaboration. And this event is a collaboration between colleagues from Athena Swan and the Development and Alumni Relations Office. We are delighted to be involved in celebrating International Women's Day, or IWD, together, and to welcome so many of you to our event today, colleagues and students from across the university, and graduates and friends from beyond, including those from Spain, Sweden, England, Scotland, Greece, Ireland, the Cayman Islands, the USA, Canada. We welcome Professor McWilliams and thank her for giving up her time to join us today, and we very much look forward to hearing her story. As we know, the theme of IWD 2022 is Break the Bias, and you may have seen some of the university's social media activity relating to this and the hashtag Break the Bias pose selfies. Whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it difficult for women to move ahead. And knowing that bias exists isn't enough. Action is needed to level the playing field. And so to explore this theme, we will hear how Monica has chosen to break the bias and forged women's equality. And to facilitate the conversation with Monica, Professor Mary Hannon Fletcher, the university's Athena Swan champion, will be asking her some questions. But before I hand over to Mary, a little bit on the housekeeping arrangements for the afternoon. All attendee mics and cameras will be off for the duration of the event. And we're also recording the event and we'll make it available over the next week or so. And we'll do that through our Insight channel, and also we may be distributed by email as well to everyone who registered. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Professor Mary Hannon Fletcher. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Maria. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Monica McWilliams today. I just want to introduce her to our panelists, to everyone who's attending today. As you will know, Monica is a professor in Transitional Justice Institute here at Ulster University. She co-founded the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition in 1996 and was elected to a multi-peace negotiations and as a signatory to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. As if that wasn't enough, Monica was then elected as the first Northern Ireland Legislative Assembly until 2003 and subsequently served as Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission at drafting the advice on the first Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. She was then appointed as Commissioner to the Independent Reporting Commission for the Disbandment of Paramilitary Organisations in 2017, and she currently works with Syrian women involved in the Geneva negotiations. Professor McWilliams has been an author of numerous publications, including many groundbreaking research publications on domestic and intimate partner violence in Northern Ireland. She's a specialist in conflict resolution. She's chaired Interpeace, which is an international peace-building NGO, and served on the board of TROCRA, the Irish Development Agency. If that was not enough, another cherry on top of this career cake, it's not just one, but it's many, is her memoir, Stand Up, Speak Out, published by Blackstaff Press. This charts Monica's activism over the decades, from the civil rights protests in the 60s to involvement in the women's movement and the foundation of the Women's Coalition, and includes her role in signing and implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. Monica has often described herself as an ordinary woman in an extraordinary time, but clearly she's a trailblazer. So Monica, you're very welcome. And I want to thank you so very much for agreeing to take part in our celebrations of International Women's Day today. I can honestly think of no one better to share with us their experiences of biases and how they handle them. You've had such a varied and distinguished career that we could have many in conversations just to try to cover it. So today, we're just going to try to encompass as much as possible in the time we have. So let me start, first of all, really, it would be lovely to hear a little bit about your early life, your upbringing, and those early memories that shaped you. Would you mind sharing some of those experiences with us today?
Of course, Mary, and thank you to the university for inviting me to speak on International Women's Day. And happy International Women's Day, though actually using the word happy at the minute is a bit of a contradiction, given the terrible things that we're watching coming in from Ukraine. And having been there, I really can understand what it must be like to have to pack up and leave home. I just closed my eyes for a minute and thought this morning that 2 million people, the entire population of Northern Ireland, just evacuating at a moment's notice. So in any case, perhaps we'll get round to that at some stage. But my formative years were certainly in a small town, village actually, in County Derry, known as Kilrea, outside Coleraine. And they were very important years because you never forget the values that were instilled in you from an early age. My mother was a good listener, very independent woman. She had worked in a creamery in Ballyrashane, and she knew the value of earning money. And she taught us from a very early age, the women in the family, as young girls and becoming adult women, always have some money to call your own. Because she knew, and it's important to say this on International Women's Day, that she had no choice when she got married. And she had to give up her job. The Sex Discrimination Act didn't come in until 1975, which allowed women to remain in employment. So I say in the book that she certainly knew what the proverb meant. I thought I saw two people, but it was only a man and his wife. And she was a homemaker and a mother, and obviously very conservative society, as Northern Ireland was in those days. But really put a huge value on education. It was free, something they didn't know, either of my parents, both leaving school at a fairly early age. Though she went on to the agricultural college, and in the book I write about how she got a competency in butter making and rural housewifery. And it was the rural housewifery, obviously, that came to be a big part of her life. Yeah. But education was hugely important in our house, and I was a reader. She caught me often when she sent me to clean the upstairs, lying under the bed reading books instead of using the Hoover. And in fact, later as a mother myself, I realised how delighted I would have been if I'd caught my children under beds reading books, because it was seen as such a luxury. She was a multitasker, and she taught me from an early age to be the same. She would have been out in the farmyard picking the food for our dinner, which was the chickens. And she taught me how to knit and sew and do all those things, which I wasn't particularly interested in. But my father was the opposite. He was the talker, she was the listener. And I went with him. I much preferred to go with him to the cattle markets and watch him negotiate. And I guess from that early age, I was watching how he did it. Mm-hmm. And when they spat on their hands and made a deal with the person that they were sharing or selling the cattle to, that deal was their word. And mm-hmm. so I understood that from an early age, and how they were the people that in the town that others came to when they needed help. And from an early age, I watched my father establish a cooperative movement in the town of Swatraw, where it was a kind of not-for-profit, where all the farmers came together. And I wouldn't have known any of that language. But having gone with him and watched it, I realised the importance of neighbours collaborating and cooperating when times were hard. The credit union was something else that started up. And then later came, obviously, the civil rights movement. But the first chapter of the book, I was told, in any memoir is crucial, mm-hmm. because people want to know, where did you come from? What were your values? And they also came from my teachers and from school. And there were good teachers, and there were also, and mostly at that early age, there were nuns. And one or two were not so kind, and I put that in the book. But I did love school, and I loved the drama and the arts, and I loved the sports. So I was a team player, and I preferred to play in a team, and that's the way I still am to this day. And so at times later in my life, when I had to run by myself in an election, in a constituency, instead of in a system that we'd run for in the peace talks, which was across the country as teams, I realized which of the two I preferred. And it was always when I was in a team with others. So those were things that I learned in the farmyard, in the fields, in the town, and at school. But most of all, from my multiple cousins. I have 86 first cousins, Mary.
Goodness,
so you learn to find your voice from a very early age when you're surrounded by so many in the house at night.
You mentioned the civil rights movement. I was going to go on to that next. You cut your teeth, as you say yourself, on the civil rights movement at a very young age. And so I'm really interested in what brought you to that movement and how that's impacted your career and life since then.
Yes, and when you asked me about my early years, one of the chapters in the book also talks about the segregated community that I lived in. I mean, that sounds like a very idyllic childhood, but we were very conscious from an early age of the differences between Catholics and Protestants, which really children should not have that driven into them because of their name or what school they went to or whatever. And so in the book, I talk about the different dance halls. I lived next to the Orange Hall, but we didn't go to the Orange Hall. We went to the Parish Hall directly across the street. So it was university that brought me to meet boys in particular from the opposite religion. And I wanted desperately to find out if they were any different. Discovered they weren't actually. All they were cars and football. So they were exactly the same, but that segregated community, there was two of everything. You know, two chemists, two dentists, everything. And so in many ways, when the civil rights movement took off and it was the right to fair housing and fair employment and the right to have the franchise to vote because of the gerrymandering situation that existed, I was brought up in the family watching what was happening in the United States. And the civil rights movement had started, Martin Luther King speeches were coming in, the television had come in black and white to our house around the mid-60s. And so when that wave came across the Atlantic and hit Northern Ireland, we were more than ready to understand what civil rights was about. And most of the time, and even I'd say in the book, how Ivan Cooper, a member of the Church of Ireland, an independent MP, supported us, came to our house, and we supported him in that movement, which later he became involved in the SDLP. And so it was a wide-ranging movement, but I never believed for 1 minute that it wouldn't succeed. I always thought this will bring change and we will move on. And I couldn't have believed if somebody had told me back then that there would be another 30 years of conflict as a result of the repression that we experienced in trying to keep that civil rights movement down. It was the wrong thing to do. But retrospect is a great person to have at the table. And even the Bill of Rights was going through Parliament at Stormont at the time. It was Sheila Murnaghan, another brave woman from the Liberal Party, and a Liberal member of the Stormont Parliament, who could not get her motion on a Bill of Rights in 1965. 5 times she tried and 5 times it failed. Now, looking back in history, if that had gone through over 50 years ago, perhaps we wouldn't have lived with the conflict that we did. And there's messages in that for other conflicts, as we now see in Ukraine today.
It's really quite scary but rather insightful to raise those issues, absolutely. And I suppose that leads you into looking over your early career and some of those early choices that you made. You started your career at Ulster, and in terms of your career path, how did it develop before and after leaving university? Or did you fall into roles, or was it all just a well thought out plan?
Well, some of it was thought out. I knew what I didn't want to do. when I left school. And mostly back then, the choice was teaching or nursing. I hadn't really thought about being a school teacher. And I thought about social science. This new subject called sociology was being introduced at university. And the joke about ologies, psychology, anthropology, and sociology. I didn't even know really what the subjects were, but began to experiment and find out about them. And I thought, yeah, they all sound very interesting. And so I ended up choosing to do a social science degree that led me on later to doing urban planning, which really was about community action and participating with communities and how they wanted their communities redeveloped. And it was a big period of change in Belfast at that time. The motorway was being driven through Belfast. Communities were rising up against it. I got involved in the Shankill as a result of a book that was written called The Rape and Plunder of the Shankill by another urban planner. And then I had the opportunity, Mary, of going on a scholarship to the United States. And that really was also very formative. I say in the book that Detroit was as famous for racism as Belfast had been for sectarianism. And I had a great mentor there. And this is a message to all of us in universities, that you never know how influential you are as a teacher or as a lecturer or as a mentor, because sometimes the students don't tell you that.
Yeah.
And I often try to find this professor, an African-American professor, who allowed me to join his all Black class because I came from Belfast.
Oh.
And my mother was absolutely distraught at the idea that I was going to Detroit. She said, "You're going to that dangerous city?" And I said, "Mum, our house has been bombed 3 times in the past 5 years, and you're worried about me going to Detroit?" But it was a very rundown city, as you can imagine, in the mid-70s, with the race riots and the way that people were being treated in the inner city of Detroit, and particularly the African-American community, was a lesson for me. And again, I learned a great deal. And the apartheid movement was starting,
yes.
And the campaign against nuclear disarmament, and the women's movement. And so when I came home, I was ready to throw myself heart and soul into all of those. And so that was also an experience that I would say is a lesson for students. It's really good to get out for a while, see what's happening elsewhere, learn from other cultures. But I was very, well, I wouldn't say homesick, but I was very heartsick watching the troubles raging in Northern Ireland each night on the 6 o'clock news. And I knew that as soon as I would get my qualification that I wanted to go back.
Yeah.
I felt I needed to contribute, that I had been very blessed in many ways with the education that I'd been given, which by then was 6 or 7 years of an education. And I felt, no, it's time now to get home and to get stuck in. And that's when I applied for the job for Ulster University and got it and remained there for decades.
Yeah. Well, certainly you came back, absolutely, and you joined Ulster University. And I would be particularly interested to hear about how you became involved in women's studies and social policies, when really at the time that wasn't on the agenda at all.
Yes.
And I suppose you led a bit down that road already, but so what was the motivation there? If you talk us through that a wee bit.
I had become involved with Women's Aid on the issue of domestic violence, and there were no shelters, no refuges at that time in Northern Ireland. And so we started campaigning to open those up to get the legislation changed. And I was teaching mostly around the issue of housing policy and trying to get those made homeless as a result of domestic violence priority, which is now the case, to be rehoused. And I began to think about it in terms of social policy. And in particular, I could see a huge gap of the women leaders in those communities not having any accredited educational qualifications. And they couldn't get any further in terms of what they wanted to do. So I designed a course along with others and called the Certificate in Women's Studies, which was an access course, the equivalent of A-levels. Because most of these women had a very bad experience at their schools and were told that they couldn't count, or that they were stupid, or just for financial reasons had to leave school really early. and fend for their family. And when I opened the doors to those women, they were the most brilliant students. They were hungry and they really wanted to learn, have skills, but also it was a different form of education. And so we started making it an interactive program, using all different kinds of teaching methods, which opened the door also to seeing what you could do as a teacher back in the early 80s, actually. And they blossomed. And it was a very proud day because obviously they weren't graduates, as we know, university graduates with gowns and their parchment paper, but I gave them parchment paper and we swapped a gown and they got their photographs taken as real graduates. And many of them came back, did their degrees and went on indeed to do PhDs, all because of this little course that we called Certificate in Women's Studies. And eventually it went out to the regional technical colleges and it went out of the university. And I learned also that the importance of childcare at university was important. I always say there are 4 C's: childcare, confidence, culture, and custom. And often they keep us from doing the things that we want to do, and cash. And those were the barriers. And we somehow, working with the university, who were, open to this idea, quite strict actually on making sure that we had a mathematics component. So I had to find innovative ways of not frightening the students, the women mature students, away from the course because they had to succeed in doing a maths component, but we got there. And so that chapter is called Putting Gender on the Agenda.
Yes.
And later then I was commissioned, very fortunately, to do a huge piece of work on domestic violence. And that led to a change in legislation and policy. And in turn led to a great deal of research being undertaken at Ulster that put Ulster on the map, Ulster University on the map, in relation to breaking new ground, and became known as seminal research. And people came to the university to talk to us and to meet with us and to find out in the middle of a conflict what the impact of that conflict was on what I called intimate terrorism.
Wow, that's interesting. That's quite a dramatic title, isn't it?
Yeah. But it was, Mary, because you know that there were a lot of armed groups around.
Oh, yes.
And the police did not go into areas in Northern Ireland where they were obviously susceptible to being shot at.
Yeah.
And so what do you do if you're in a situation of domestic violence? And so there's a whole chapter in the book about that and the alternatives, but also the coercive control, that term that we now use, that was used by paramilitaries. And the access to guns, legal and illegal. And so I did a study on homicide and showed how much higher it was in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in the UK or the Republic of Ireland. And so when you produce the data and also have the qualitative interviews, and they were horrendous. I called the book Bringing It Out in the Open because that subject had never been brought out in the open. It was silenced. There was a stigma attached to it. There was a shame attached to it. And yet it was part of the conflict and it needed to be brought out in the open. And it led then to enormous changes occurring as a result.
That's really fantastic. A huge impact that work's had, definitely. You mentioned mentor, one particular mentor earlier, and our alumni audience wanted to ask, and that they'd be very keen to know if you've had mentors along the way, and those who've supported you in your next steps.
Yes, I did. And there was a fantastic woman at the University of Ulster at the time called Celia Davis. And we set up a centre for research on women, not a great acronym called CROW. And we knew that, and we knew there would be jokes about it. And she was the one who encouraged us to then produce a design and develop a master's in women's studies, which we did, and it was interdisciplinary. So women came from all different faculties to teach on that. It was in the evening, and it was part-time. And it was very highly subscribed to. And we began then to write her own books, textbooks, which weren't available. But she was a tremendous mentor and really helped me in my career. So I'm a great believer in mentors. And outside of the university then, sometimes they're your friend. When you won't apply for a job, they say, you could do this, go for it. And there's a little worm inside your head thinking, I'm not so sure. And without knowing it, those people are literally your mentor because they help you in that process. So yes, I've been very fortunate. And indeed in the Women's Coalition, there were many, many women with different skill sets who were inspirational in many ways and didn't seek the limelight and assisted me at times when things were rough and tough. And I was very glad that they were at my side. And I was very glad that they were at my back.
Yeah.
And you need those people with you. Otherwise, as I say in the book, you don't do this alone.
No.
You're not a single flight bird, you're a long flight bird. And, you know, you can go faster alone, but you go further together. And that's when I realized the importance of having good support systems around me.
Absolutely. You mentioned briefly the Women's Coalition, and I'm going to now move on to your time in the Women's Coalition and politics. And so particularly focusing on International Women's Day this year, where we're talking about break the bias, looking at gender equality, etc. I've read your book. I really enjoyed it. But having said that, I was shocked to read how you were treated. The clear discrimination against your gender by MLA colleagues was horrific. How did you deal with that?
Well, we hadn't expected it. It was a baptism of fire. Again, the peace talks were declared very quickly, and we had 6 weeks to get ready. And we were very focused on 3 principles: human rights, equality, and inclusion. And we hadn't really thought we would have a lot of pushback. And we got it even before we were elected. Some senior members in the book, I refer to them by name, saying, oh, they're a cult and they'll grow in on each other and disappear. Or where were these women when the war was being fought, as if they'd fallen out of the sky? And they were the leaders. One went on to be First Minister, another went on to be a Deputy First Minister. And that should have prepared us. But when I got onto the floor of the Forum for Dialogue and Understanding, which I say in the book, we renamed the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding, because it ended up being a monologue. And it wasn't nice the way that some of those men bonded together and laughed and joked about the treatment of us women. And we had an insult of the week notice board, and we wrote up the insult and the time and the dates. And when an individual would pass us, they'd say, I didn't say that. And I'd say, yes, it's in Hansard. But you're not so proud of it now, are you? When you see it in broad daylight. Now, some of them thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And would often say to me, can you not take a bit of crack? Or if you can't stick the heat, get out of the kitchen. As if this was normal behavior and should be normalized. And we said, no, it's unacceptable and needs to change. And that famous time when one individual, Ian Paisley Jr., was caught mooing at me across the chamber when I had a very well-prepared speech on the BSE disease, if you remember at the time, people were infected as a result of eating meat that had been contaminated. And I, as a farmer's daughter, had done my homework as well. And suddenly I could hear this mooing going on.
Oh my God.
And, but, you know, I was told this is a bit of fun, but it wasn't. And any of the visitors in the gallery were appalled. And as a result, people would come up to me in the street and say, you know, that's a really very poor way for people to behave in an elected chamber, and we're voting for you the next time. So instead of it pushing us back, it actually made us stronger. The other thing to do, Mary, is to remember this is about them. It's not about you. Hold your head up, although because it really is about lowering your self-esteem. And when your reputation, which is all you have, is being attacked, it's a hard and lonely place to be. So again, it's important that you have others encouraging you. And we had to make a decision whether to stay in that forum or leave. And we decided to stay because we had a principle of inclusion, which said including all voices. But there were times when I questioned whether those particular voices should be given the amount of space that they had been given. So it's looking back now that I realise that it was good that I stood up, and some of the stuff that was being said was shocking. And I'm very fortunate that I had the Hansard reports. And as an academic, I was able to fall back and quote on them and find them. And I knew how to find them, because had they not actually been recorded and written down as verbatim fact, I could have been accused of making it up.
Yes.
Because it was so shocking. And yet there it was in the formal reports. And of course, I had to be careful in that. Yes. When people are still alive, they'll be the first to come after you and take you to court. So the memoir is quite controversial, but it was also very carefully written, because I had been down that road a few times and I wasn't going back down it again.
I want to thank you personally, and I'm sure many of us do, for hanging on in there, because it has had such an impact on what came to follow. But yeah, reading it and then realizing in conversation with you that actually that was probably the tip of the iceberg, what you included in your book. Mm-hmm. We have somebody, we've a chat message from Heather Fleming, who has said, Monica, I'll never forget seeing footage of you standing up to speak in the Good Friday Agreement meeting and Nigel Dodds, DUP, shouting, "Sit down, woman." Love the title, if you remember, Stand Up, Speak Out. You know, and there you go. There's another example of it. Absolutely.
And the other thing that I want to say is that was then and this is now. Mm-hmm. We said, look, let's not be just the answering to the media each time they ask us how do we feel when things like that were shouted at us. Yeah. I wanted to ensure that we were being taken seriously on the politics of the peace process, and that our positions were being taken seriously in the peace agreement, and for journalists to come and ask us about those issues. And it's a bit like Ukraine at the minute, where so much of the focus is on women doing the humanitarian aid. But mm-hmm. the women in Ukraine that I know are also negotiating that aid, which is political. They're also negotiating on the international scene. And so it's really important that women are given their place, not just for how they feel when men behave badly, but what is their political position? What are their proposals? What are they writing into this agreement that will make a difference? Yes. And that's what kept us at the table, Mary. We used good humour at times just to, displace what was coming at us. And when we were told to stand by our men, we would sing "Stand by Your Man." And they realised that they weren't hitting the mark the way they wanted to, but we were more focused on the peace talks and getting to a peace agreement. And that kept us there. Yeah. And that was really important. And the point I'm really saying is that the Nigel Dodds that I knew then and others that I knew then did change. We all change. Now, you might well ask, is it because there is now social media and you can't say the things that you might have said back then? And some people still are, but they're being called out now in a way that they weren't. But also, there's a more consciousness, and perhaps I hope today on International Women's Day particularly so, on the importance of having women in decision-making roles. Yeah. That we're not silly and we shouldn't be told to shut up and sit down, that we have something to say if you'd only listen. Yeah, no, I think well said, absolutely. I'm going to jump into this next one because I've heard you talk before on speaking about some of those very important issues that you wanted to raise, some of them directly related to women, but not all, that weren't included in the Good Friday Agreement. Could you share some of those topics with us? I mean, we were, I say, in 2 or 3 of the chapters deal with what was in the agreement, and it was a very comprehensive agreement in terms of policing reform, governance arrangements, social and economic issues. really important issues in terms of conflict resolution. But in Northern Ireland, there were other issues that we felt in a chapter that we wrote called Reconciliation and the need to pay attention to victims. Because as you can imagine, the only people that often get to a peace table are the constitutional parties, the old timers, or the armed groups. And it's rare that you actually have a group of people from civil society at a peace negotiating table who are putting victims' needs on the agenda. And in fact, when I looked back writing the book, I discovered that we had also proposed that we should have a Peace and Justice Commission, which would have been the legacy. And it just disappeared into the ether. Now, perhaps that was a mistake we made. We should have fought harder to get it included, because these were all coming into what we called confidence building committees. And so the other issues that were in those committees were the Bill of Rights, Human Rights Commission, Equality Commission. But the things that we specifically put on the table as calling our own were the need to have a civic forum where civil society could be included, bringing expert testimony into as an advisory group on social, cultural and economic issues. Now, how important that would have been today in terms of even when the assembly disappears.
Yes.
And these are people, from experts by experience, the women's sector, the disability sector, the victim sector, trade unions, businesses, civil leaders from communities. And it did happen, but it was stood down after a number of weeks. Once the power sharing arrangements were sorted out, they decided they didn't need a civic forum, which was a shame and a real absence, as we've seen the difference it's made in the Republic of Ireland, where politicians couldn't agree on some very contentious issues that were too hot to handle. And they gave it to the Citizens' Assembly, and they managed to bring forward resolutions that went to referendum. And when people looked and said, how was it possible to arrive at these incredibly difficult decisions in a way that created some consensus? So the Civic Forum, integrated education, hard to believe that it's actually over 60 years since the first movement started there. And it's still being talked about as a gap. Shared housing, where the housing executive would create mixed housing estates. There were other issues around the right of women to full and equal political participation. Resources for our young people, because we were very nervous that the tidal wave of peace wouldn't lift all boats. And that some communities would get left behind, and particularly our young people. So we put all of that into that chapter, and it was rarely talked about during the referendum, except for the victims. And I'm very glad that we put some sentences and proposals in around victims, because when I went out to convince people to say yes to the agreement during the referendum, people were very cross at prisoners being released.
Yes.
Or about the changes to the RUC. And some people referred to it as a terrorist charter. And I was able to read out to them what had been written about victims and what we needed to do. And then look how long it took us to make reparations, to give pensions to the injured, to look at what we needed to do to get proper processes in place to deal with the past. And people regard that as, some people and some politicians regard that as soft issues. And yet these are the most difficult to resolve. We did reform the police. We did get governance arrangements in place. We did the North-South relationships, all the ministerial council, all the things that people said were impossible to resolve after the conflict in Northern Ireland. And yet we did those. And look at the soft issues that are still outstanding. And they're not soft, and they do need to be resolved. Bill of Rights, integrated education, civic forum, and particularly now with Brexit. Those are so important to give civil society a voice. And most importantly, dealing with the legacy of the past and the work I'm now doing, which is disbanding paramilitary organisations.
No, absolutely. I'm very grateful that you included victims in obviously the Good Friday Agreement. I'm completely biased myself in that I was lobbying for the pension. And while it's been approved and we've got it, it really hasn't, not many have been paid out yet, but we're much further along.
And Mary, I take from your experience and the experience of your colleagues and way of in which I'm involved, as you know.
Oh, totally, I know, a great supporter.
With the victim sector. I mean, it's incredible, the empowerment that came as a result of people supporting each other, knowing how to change the policy, knowing how to lobby the Secretary of State, and bringing it all the way through to the legislation, and getting that to move fast so that people are not ending up in their graves before they finally get the much needed payments that they needed all those years before. And you were one of the people leading that, and I pay tribute to you for doing that.
Well, thank you very much. I wasn't leading. I was a member of a group, and I joined it later than others, but I certainly did as much as I could to try and push it forward. That brings me really the issue of legacy. I mean, what is your view on the British government trying to pull down any issues to do with legacy, prosecutions, given that this is such an important issue here in Northern Ireland? None of our politicians, for once, they're all on the same page, that they absolutely think that this shouldn't stop. This needs to go ahead. If that had been in your Good Friday Agreement, Monica.
Yeah, we should have. We should have added this in the Good Friday Agreement. We should. And it was there. It wasn't. What wasn't was what exactly the process would look like.
Yeah.
And we've had multiple processes: the Eames Bradley process, the Parliament House process, and now once again back at the table. But we will have to find a way through this, and it's not the current proposals. And I'm certain it won't end up with the current proposals because they actually breach international human rights law.
Yeah.
And so the UK government cannot stand at Westminster and put through legislation that simply gives everyone an amnesty for huge human rights violations. But at the same time, everyone will have to give something to the process and understand that we need to bring this to an end. And it will affect my work on disband of paramilitaries, because there's a huge overlap there. And I'm hopeful in the next few years that we will get this sorted. And I do know myself that there is a model out there, and we've discussed it, about how we can do better practice than what we have. And I'm a professor in transitional justice, and we should have been looking at what other countries did and then amend it to our own context. But I'm also on the Canova board.
Oh, yeah, well, that's fabulous. Do you want to maybe just mention to our audience about Canova?
Well, yes, and John Boucher, who's the chief counsel from Bedfordshire, has been brought over to look at those investigations where informers were implicated and the murders that occurred as a result. And he has carried out a very good process that has been very much inclusive of victims and the families, who now support the process he has put in place. So there is a model there, and he had strong powers, which is very important. Otherwise, he may not have got people to give him evidence. And that doesn't mean that his cases may all end up, very few of them may end up in court, perhaps none of them. But the potential is there. And that's why people have come forward and have engaged with him. And he will be bringing out his interim report this summer, which is a thematic report. And again, it'll be another step from which we need to learn and how to do this legacy. But certainly people should be entitled to inquests, as you know, Mary. It's a civil right.
Absolutely.
To know and to get a narrative of the circumstances of the death, where there's a non-natural death. And that's a very basic human right. And to remove that from anyone because there's been a conflict is not, cannot stand up. And I think the lesson has been well learned there. So we will move forward, but the pace at which we move forward has been far too slow.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, but at least there's some movement. A little bit of a generic question here, focusing on the current International Women's Day. Do you have any suggestions from your own experience, really how each of us could break the bias? And that really is regardless of who we are or what our position is. What would your advice be?
Well, there's many, many ways to break that bias. And most of my life I've been working on, first it was on research that fed into breaking the bias of legislation and policy. And so I'm quite pleased this week to be watching the Assembly putting forward legislation on stalking, on coercive control, on intimate partner violence, all of the things that we said needed to happen and are now beginning to happen, and we're catching up with places like Scotland, and breaking the bias in terms of ignoring some of those terrible things that were done by institutions, the institutional historical abuse.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And again, the importance of safeguarding vulnerable women in terms of how we deal with rape inquiries. And these are all lessons actually for post-conflict situations too.
Yeah.
And someday in Ukraine, we'll be having to look at all of this. And then breaking the bias in work, and looking at job evaluation, looking at promotion, looking at recruitment, and basically looking at fair employment. When I started, the only fair employment that was talked about in Northern Ireland was religion.
Yes.
And hence, on International Women's Day back in 1977, the first rally took place to have the Sex Discrimination Act extended to Northern Ireland, because the Secretary of State said the only problem in Northern Ireland was religion. Not gender. And so that piece of legislation came in. We had to get it changed because the only bias they thought about was employment and not about facilities and services. So women could still not get a mortgage if she was married.
Yeah.
She had to get her husband to sign it. And there was lots of facilities. For instance, I tell a story about how Eileen Evanson, another academic at Ulster University, planted herself in the pub in central Belfast in order to get thrown out purposely in front of the cameras, because no woman was allowed to drink in a pub. Yes. And this was a facility. They could drink in the lounge quietly where nobody could see them, but they weren't allowed to mix with men in the bar. And so we knew that we had been paying for the license of these premises through our taxes, because that's where the license comes from. And that's how it got changed. And the same with eventually the golf clubs. And so the snowball kept cumulatively getting more and more wider as we broke more and more biases. And today that still exists. There are many different movements now looking at different parts of how this bias exists, whether it's in the media, in politics, in the university, in business, in all walks of life. And it's good to see that individuals are calling it out and making changes.
I'm sure.
I think I told you when I first came to the university and was asked to sit in an interviewing panel, there was a very biased statement made by one of the panel members saying that he thought the best time for women is before they have children and after the children are grown up, because then they can properly concentrate on their job. And he started that sentence with, "in my experience." And so it was a very biased statement, but he had no consciousness of that until he was told that, in fact, is not a fact, but it's also a very biased thing to be saying on an interviewing panel with the individuals who come in front of us.
I'm sure some of the younger audience here are quite shocked by what we've lived through. Hopefully things are improving and better today. I want to leave that really jump.
Mary, it's really important to say that, because I do think what you've just said is crucial. There's a lot of complacency.
Yeah.
That we couldn't go back, or it couldn't possibly be like that anymore. I find that what we hold, we need to sustain and maintain, because you can go backwards.
Yeah.
You can lose the gains you make. So there should be no room for complacency. And that's what I said in a piece I did for the Irish Independent on Saturday, is to pass the baton on to the next generation to hold on to it.
I want to move on to ask you a little about the women's groups you've worked with. You've worked with women's groups in conflict zones worldwide and continue to do so, most recently in Syria, with those women involved in negotiations in Geneva. Given your experience, how would you advise that we as individuals and as governments support the women in Ukraine right now?
Well, in many different ways. This morning on Radio Foyle, I said that I had watched what had happened in Syria, And when the Russians bombarded Aleppo from the air, barrel bombs, and actually dropped chemical weapons, crimes against humanity. And it's really important that the international community document that. We can't deal with it right now, but I'm glad to hear that Gordon Brown has raised it. The International Criminal Court should be paying attention. Humanitarian aid is crucial at the moment. First, you have to find ways to get food and water to those who are starving. And that's been incredible from even our own local communities, and the university today, I see, has put out an email showing people how they can help, and through funding. But and all of that's possible, and really important to those emergency crisis organizations, because donations are incredibly important. And that humanitarian aid is incredibly important, and that's happening. It's being negotiated. It was, as President Zelensky said, immoral to suggest that those corridors should go into Russia instead of into the countries to which the people knew they would find some safety. And at the international level, it is good to see Europe finally coming together. Yes, we needed those sanctions. They were late. Does it always have to be a crisis that creates people to sit up and see economic crime being fast-tracked at the minute through Westminster and legislation to go after the oligarchs, when we knew that they were existing there for many years? And it's good to see the banking system attacking the illegality of the money that was being put to very corrupt purposes in terms of aiding Putin to do what he was doing. So all of those and different angles, coming at it from different angles. But at the end of the day, I'm very impressed by what the civil leaders are doing, civil society, the women. 20% of the Ukrainian parliament are women. They rose in numbers after the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. And it was mostly they who took to the street, as was the case in the Arab Spring Revolution as well. And they demanded social, economic and political empowerment, and now it's paying off. Those women are decision makers. They're also signing the petition, the Kiev Declaration, 94 signatories, and predominantly, again, half of them being women. And yet years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. And the international attention, finding champions through their ambassadors who are predominantly women. Very brave and very good to see these role models. And our own role models, the women journalists, the fantastic women journalists from the BBC, Orla Guerin, Rita Sharbaki and Lisa Doucette, right in the middle on the front line, being able to get the media message out, and the women inside of Ukraine getting the media message out. And what I've learned in the last few days compared to years ago when I worked in other conflicts was the importance of social media.
Absolutely.
And getting the immediate message to where the aid is most needed and where the serious problems are, and create an organization around it. And Syria did that. The Syrian women that I'm involved in do it. And also what they're doing today is also trying to get people released from prison after they were detained and tortured. And women are much more vulnerable in those situations when they're imprisoned. And I have real fears about what's going to happen if the Russian army are not stopped.
Yeah, well, I share those fears with you, definitely. Absolutely, it's a very worrying time. I'm going to ask one last question, and then if we've got time, there are a few comments in the chat that I'd like to go to. But I'd like to bring you back home and to close you about and just talk a bit about your latest initiative, Politics in School. How did that come about? And, you know, how is it that you see that that's going to help us in our society moving forward?
It's a great initiative. It started up a few years ago. One individual, retired journalist from the BBC, Peter Veal, saw a gap because of the segregated nature of our school system. And he just also knew that teachers in schools are reluctant to talk about politics.
Yeah.
And so he brought a number of schools together in the first instance. St. Dominic's and Friends in Lisburn came together. And then he decided he was really keen to get working class schools and working class areas. I shouldn't say working class schools, schools in disadvantaged areas, which have much less of an opportunity to meet kids from the other side. And they're the ones that are blossoming, these schools now. And I think we have over 30 schools involved. And they're able to engage in every subject under the sun and do it in a way that's facilitated. They've been to Westminster, they've been down south, they're now meeting schools across the border and the schools east-west. And so it's very important for young people to be given that opportunity at that early age, because those connections are incredibly important to them. And of course, they're having fun. They're finding creative and innovative ways during COVID, using the internet, and also using music and the arts to engage, and drama. So I'm learning as much from them in terms of the new ways of helping them to, in our very segregated system, to make the much needed connections that break down the barriers and the prejudice and the bias that they have of strangers, who now, in fact, they refer to as their best friends.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yes, in this divided community, I think starting with those younger people and trying to allow them the opportunity to interact with others who are not from the same background as them, just to demystify the whole process and allow them a safe environment to discuss and talk. And, you know, that, I think that's so valuable, because so few of us when we were young had that opportunity, you know, and I think that's really excellent.
Yeah.
There's a couple of comments in the chat that I just wanted to bring you to. One I'm not really sure about, but I'm sure that you can deal with this. We need to be clear about the coroner's discretion about decisions to hold public inquests. Can only in law be amended to remove coroner's discretion, which is absolute, human rights notwithstanding?
The legacy process, Mary, can you give me that again? I was trying to find it on the chat line. I couldn't see the question. It's
from Dr. Philip O'Keefe.
Mm-hmm.
Need to be clear about the coroner's discretion.
Okay. I'm not sure what's driving that.
I'm not sure.
Of course, the coroner would be involved in any legacy process. The coroners here have done a fantastic job, and particularly where the Attorney General oversees those that were not fulfilled in the way that they should have been and returned to having inquests. I mean, I make the comparison when I was Chief Commissioner with the inquest system in the Republic of Ireland, and it's night and day difference. And in the peace agreement, it said we should have had a Charter of Rights. So it didn't matter which side of the border you were on, you would have the same entitlement, and that should be the same entitlement to inquests. But without knowing the detail behind that question, that's as much as I can say. But my point is that there should be an entitlement to inquests. That goes without saying, where there's an unnatural death and where the state or indeed non-state actors have been involved.
Thank you. I mean, I wasn't sure about that, but I thought as it was there, I would just ask it. There were a few other comments about Russia and the oil, etc. And
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah,
and it's absolutely the case.
Yeah,
that Putin still has huge resources, and so the big question will be: are we prepared to pay higher prices for oil and gas? And we most certainly should be. It's going to be tough, and we need to find ways of subsidizing those who will find it very hard in the winter. But you know, if that's, and Europe should never have had that dependency. It should have been years ago watching for where, and particularly in Germany, where its gas was coming from, because all of this was on the cards in terms of how Russia would play that card about its gas and oil. And likewise, it made me think last night watching Boris Johnson saying he was coming up with an alternative energy plan. Once again, here we are with a tragedy in the world.
Exactly.
And it's driving them to an alternative energy plan when we should have been already thinking about that. But not just because of climate change, but because it makes for good policy. Yeah. And now we will find ourselves going in the direction of alternative energy because of the dependency on Russian gas and oil. And as for corruption, yes, it was the case that there was a lot of corruption in Ukraine, and they do fight amongst each other over that issue. Having said that, they are pulling together as citizens of the country at the minute. And it's one of the reasons why President Zelensky became president, because he spoke out against the corruption. And it's also one of the reasons why the other European countries are watching and have told Ukraine and many others in Eastern Europe that they needed to get their house in order if they wanted to join the European Union.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of, we can discuss for a long time about the good and the bad of each of these states. I mean, but at the minute we're at a crisis, and we need to focus on that. And it's a very worrying crisis. That really brings me to an end. I mean, we could go on for quite a long time. There's a lot of other comments in the box about, you know, thanking Monica for being such a remarkable role model and things like that, and all the things that you've done to make major changes here for us. And we're very grateful. I'm now going to take the opportunity to hand over for Eddie Frail, of our Director of Development and Alumni Relations, who's going to close the event. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Monica. And it's great to be part of the worldwide activity on International Women's Day, as different groups come together to celebrate women's achievements from around the world and rally the call for women's equality. And I know within the university, we have a number of different initiatives, a number of engagement via the alumni team and the like. And I know some of the graduates that we have involved in those initiatives are actually on the call today. So it's great to do that. And I think one of the issues that you have raised today, Monica, was that there is no room for complacency. You talked about the 4 C's, and I think certainly the 5th C is the danger of complacency. And that's something we'd be very mindful of. And it's great to see within the university, the Athena Swan team working with the Development Alumni Relations team, and that's something we're keen to do. We want to partner right across the university and outside the university with different agencies and individuals to build partnerships, and it's something that's becoming increasingly important for us as a university. We heard that our attendees are from all around the world, strange places. I'm sure there's a lot of places that are warmer than where I'm sitting today, where it's a bit wet and windy in Derry. So Cayman Islands sounded particularly nice. And one of the things that I would encourage is for people who are on the call to join the university's alumni network, uuconnects.com. So you can stay connected, you can network, and you can get involved. Now, if you want to find out more about Athena Swan, you can contact Maria Lockery or Samantha Kidd. And both Maria and Samantha have been pivotal in putting together this particular event today. So I would like to thank them, along with my colleague, Lucian McNamara, and the Alumni Relations team. I would like to thank Professor Mary Hannon Fletcher for her wonderful job as chair. I thought you did a great job, Mary, in keeping the conversation flowing and drawing out the pertinent points. And I said just as we started the call before we went live, I was saying that I first came across Monica, or the first time I met Monica was at Georgetown University, and I could see the esteem in which she was held in Georgetown, and she is a recognised figure around the world, and she's someone that as a university we're very, very proud to have an association with. I thought that as someone who is a mother, a wife, and sisters and daughters, that the work that you have done has been inspirational, and you have helped an awful lot of people, and it's something that you should be very proud of. And I know that as a university, we're very proud that some of our graduates have made such a significant impact. So thank you very much for that, Monica. And I will remind people that your book is called Stand Up, Speak Out. It's all good bookshops. I'm sure you can buy it online. That wasn't choreographed, but I would like to thank you very much for that. And
I have it here too.
I thought one of your lines, and I've heard it quoted in another context recently, about if you want to go faster, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. I think that's something that we really need to take on board. So thanks very much for that. And I will conclude just by thanking all the people who were able to join us today as part of our wider university community. And I hope you all have a lovely International Women's Day. So thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, and thanks to everyone who participated this afternoon and for giving me your time. And a special thanks to Mary and Maria who set this up. And goodbye on International Women's Day.
Bye, everybody. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye, Monica. Thanks a lot.